Very good.
Okay. Since we have a full room, oh, dark, good. Since we have a full room, we'll go ahead and start. My name's Gregg Marshall. I'm a digital technology developer manager, and I have to literally read that title because that's the title I was assigned. Mostly a Drupal architect for Accenture Digital. Accenture's this small consulting company, 377,000 people. I've been on Drupal.org since 2006 and really got involved in Drupal in a serious way when I went to my first DrupalCon in San Francisco in 2010. And I was doing channel marketing using Drupal sites as a support tool and was listening to people talk and realized that there was probably more opportunity to be a Drupal developer than to be a channel marketing consultant. And I happen to be an Acquia Grandmaster for what it's worth. And I wrote a book.
My name is Amanda. I'm his daughter, and I have a business degree from CU Denver and a graduate certificate in energy and sustainability from VU. But I wasn't really able to turn those into a job, so I started working with Drupal. And I just took Mike and Ella's class, our Drupal Easy Academy course. Just finished that in December. But I actually have been a Drupal.org member since 2008 because when he started Drupal, I was going to kind of try to do Drupal with him, but then I decided to focus on my degree because at the time that seemed more important. My first DrupalCon will be in Baltimore, and right now I'm actually working as an intern with the UN on the humanitarian response site. And I'm still looking for an actual paid job, so if any of you know of anything, let me know.
You want to explain Jackson?
Oh yeah, he's a character in the book. Yeah, his name is Jackson.
The book's a little different than normal, and that'll be the end of it. Okay, I have to put up this disclaimer because I work for Accenture, which is a very large company. Basically, what this is saying is I'm here as me, not as Accenture. So with that, we'll move forward. The genesis of this version of the talk was, since Amanda started the Drupal Easy Academy, the conversations we've had at meals have been significantly different and very interesting. So we were at a meal in late November with the family, and my oldest son and his wife were down from Wisconsin, and instead of knitting and pets and gardening and things like that, Amanda and I are sitting on one end of the table talking about a problem she's having with a Git repo. So that was that. So the idea we have was to come up with, well, let's just take that sort of conversation and we'll just adapt it into a fictitious version of what that conversation might have looked like if I was explaining views to her. So Amanda, tell me how your project with the UN is going.
It's going great. We're diving deeper into Drupal theming, and I've actually been able to build a couple of views. I kind of thought I knew what I was doing during the class, but now that I'm actually working on it, I'm having trouble with some of the terms.
Okay, that's very common. Views terminology, as Drupal terminology, tends to be overloaded terms. And so things that have meaning in parts of Drupal may have different meanings within views. And just to start off on a very basic level, views is the views module. So when we talk about views in the plural, almost always you're talking about the module. And before Drupal 8, it was a contributed module. It's basically what views does is create dynamic lists. Or it's a report writer for Drupal. So if any of you are old enough to remember something called Crystal Reports, it's the Crystal Reports for Drupal. And then you have the singular, the view, and that's usually one single list that is generated with the views module. So you have view and views, and you try not to mix them up. A real reason for using views is the 5 most recent blog posts that you might put on a website. If you did it manually, you would add the blog post to the site, and then you would go to the block and you would edit the block, and you would add it to the bottom of the list and delete the one at the top of the list. And so you would always have this cycle of it. with views, you add the blog post to the site, and it appears in the blog, because views can dynamically generate it based on the blog entries that are already there. Views is now in Drupal 8 Core, which is a huge move. Before that, it was the '1 contributed module if you exclude CTools, which is a support module for both views, panels, and a bunch of other modules. But views did require CTools, and in Drupal 8, almost all of the administration pages, so if you go to the content page or the user page, any of those pages are now simply views instead of being custom code like they were in previous versions of Drupal. Let's talk about what the components might be. So you start off and you've got the base or view type, sort of used interchangeably. I've heard it both ways. And this is really what you're displaying. So you'll have a view of content, or you'll have a view of users, or a view of, in Drupal 8, comments, because you can do views of comments that way. And then once you get a view defined, then you have a display. And the display might be a page, or it might be a block, and you can have more than one display. So you might have 2 pages, 1 block, or 1 page, 3 blocks. It doesn't really matter. You can have lots of displays within a view. They're just different kinds of ways of looking at it. Then you've got a format, and that might be the grid or table or unordered list level of defining how a view is put together, display. And then you've got a display type. And there are really only 2 really commonly used ones. You either do displays of content or you do displays of fields. And if you do content, then you use the display mode to determine what's being displayed. If you do fields, you tend to, you'll do it right there inside the view. I personally prefer using fields because I like the idea of having everything that's related to my view in the same spot and not depend on a display mode that may or may not be defined the same way. And then after that, you've got a couple of control parts of a view. You've got the filters and you've got sorts. And that's pretty much the basic structure of how a view works. So if you look, the view edit screen is this intimidating 3-column screen. It's very, and almost always if you see views, you don't see that 3rd column because the advanced is closed by default. There's a view setting that lets you open it by default, and I recommend using that setting because if you have it open by default, you see some of the tools that you can use that are very, very useful. So they may appear to be advanced, but they're not really as advanced as they seem. And we'll come back to them. So if we look at it sort of in column in a little larger format so that with binoculars, those of you in the back could probably read it. But you've got the title, you've got the format, which again is whether it's a list or a grid or a table or something like that. It shows fields. And then you've got the fields that you're going to display, the filters that you're going to apply, and the sort order you're going to put it in. In the middle, you've got either block settings or page settings in most cases. You've got the header and the footer, so you can put some arbitrary text above your view results. You can put some arbitrary text below your view results. You can also have a no results behavior, which is another piece of arbitrary text that would display if your view happened to generate no results. And we'll explain how that happens later. And then finally, you've got the setup for your pager. And a pager allows you to display a lot more content than would comfortably fit on a single page. So by default, Views normally does it 10 items at a time and lets you page through them forward, backwards, front, back, those kinds of things. And then the 3rd column is the advanced column. And the 2 most important parts of that are contextual filters and relationships. And we'll come back and talk about those. The rest of it tends to be more subtle and truly advanced if you're getting into views. But that's pretty much it. So I got a project for you. You're still working on that real estate site, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So what I want you to do is take the content list that is this default views for managing content. And I want you to create a property maintenance list that would be applicable only to a specific user and would only show them properties because we want the salespeople who are maintaining their own listings to only see their listings and only be able to edit their listings. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Great, so the first thing I did was to duplicate the content maintenance view. That way, if I make a little mistake, I don't screw up my whole project. And then I changed the title to property maintenance.
Oops. Wrong button.
Just by clicking on the word content under title. And then I removed the bulk operations form in the field setting by clicking on the name and then just clicking on remove at the bottom of the screen. And I also removed the content type and the user author name. And since they would only display the current user's properties, or since this view will only display the current user's properties, I also removed the translation language filter, since this site only has English. And then finally, I changed the content type filter from being exposed to being fixed, and selecting the property content type. And it's very important to click save, otherwise you won't be able to view any of your changes. So this shows the before and the after. It's relatively easy, but with a fresh copy of Drupal, you only have two content types, basic and article. And they don't have very many fields. So why is views around? Is it only used on administration pages?
No, actually, the biggest reason you'd use views is for structured content. And the idea is that you can add fields to content types, or you can create content types that have fields. And that became part of the core in Drupal 7. Prior to that, it was called CCK. And you can have relationships between content types. So we could have a property content type and a realtor content type and define that there's a relationship between the two by having a field in the property that refers to the realtor. That lets you basically, what's called in database terms, normalize your data. So you don't have to keep entering the realtor's name over and over and over again as you add more. And different field types you can have are text, number, Boolean, files, images, and the reference that's used to link two kinds of content together. Plus, contributed modules will add different kinds of field types. One of my favorites in Drupal 8, because it seems to be working right now, is geolocation. Drupal 7, I used the location module, but in Drupal 8, I used the geolocation module, which adds basically a longitude, latitude, and the Google Map selector tool widget so that I don't have to enter it as longitude and latitude. I can either enter it as an address, and Google will look it up, or I can actually use the map to do that. So if we look at your real estate agency website, you've got a property which has a number of fields, the typical things, the address, where it's located, what neighborhood it's in, how many bathrooms it has, how many bedrooms it has, how many square feet, what the asking price is, all these various things that you want. And there are two reference fields, one that goes over to the owner, so you can have more than one owner attached to a property, and a different one that goes to a realtor, but they're structured basically the same. They're a person. And we could have put this together a different way and had them be the same content type. But the realtor is also the same basic structure. And then we have open houses. So if you want to schedule open houses on this particular website. So if you look at how all that fit together, you've got the property sort of in the middle. You've got open houses related to property. That means open houses has the field that's holding the reference to the property. But the property has the reference to the realtors, to the property owners, and it actually has two references, additional references that you probably don't think of, especially if you haven't worked with Drupal 8, as references, and those are two taxonomy terms. So we're using taxonomy for county and neighborhood. Those are actually an entity reference because taxonomy terms now or vocabularies are basically another kind of entity. So why don't you show me how to get a new view going?
Well, they're really easy to get going with the wizard. It starts pretty simple, but once you start clicking on the boxes, it kind of turns into a complex form. The new wizard, or the new view wizard, only does the most common use cases, which are page and block. Other displays, like attachments, you have to do manually on the edit page. So if we look at the starting widget, The first questions are pretty easy. You have to give it a name, and Drupal will automatically turn that into an internal name that it uses. And then you tell it what type of view or what entity you want to base it on. Content is the most common, so it's the default. And then if you choose content, you can select a specific content type, like property, and choose the initial sort order. Finally, you can check boxes to create a page display, a block display, or even a REST export. And then, of course, nothing is as simple as it seems. So when you click the Create a Page, a whole bunch of additional settings appear. And if you zoom in, this is what it looks like.
Yeah.
You can set the page title and the path, select what kind of display, and then in my property maintenance view, it was a table, so I'm going to do that here. You can also set the pager for when you have more listings than you can fit on one page. You can add an RSS feed, and fortunately, except for the basic view type, all of this can be changed later if you just go to the view edit screen. So Dad, what are the various parts of a view?
Okay, let's go into a little more detail of those parts we talked about earlier. So you've got a base or view type, and this is the one time, once you've made that selection in the wizard, you're stuck with it. Anything else you can change in the edit field, but it's really hard to change the base type. So the easiest thing is, if you realize you've made the wrong selection here, is delete the view, start over. And fortunately, views is pretty easy to use, so that's not a big deal. I'd say 95% of all the views I've ever seen are views of content. So that's probably the one kind of base type you'll do the most. The number two use I've seen are views of users, where you're creating lists of different kinds of users, like who might be online or who's registered or something like that. Most of the rest of these view types really are unique to Drupal 8, and it's the fact that now everything is an entity, and views deals with entities. So originally I thought, what do you do with a view of content revisions? That just didn't seem to be too useful to me. I realized it just fell out when they basically gave it the ability to do everything. And I was talking to a developer in Minneapolis, and they mentioned that their website has legal implications. And so part of what they have to do on every page is literally show the revision history of that page. So every edit and the date it was made and what changed. And so they can do that with views in Drupal 8. So that's something they can do. And you can do views of blocks now, because blocks are now entities, or block revisions. But just as importantly, you can have additional view types added by contributed or custom modules. As an example, I did a module for a project that used its own database table for performance reasons. The node just wasn't fast enough. And we were able to, by defining a certain file in the module, expose that entire table as basically a view type that we could then do views on from inside Drupal. And so the other developers didn't know how that table was put together. They just knew that there was this view type and a certain number of fields that came with it. Inside you've got displays, and again, page and block are the two most common. Master is actually in every view, but what happens is once you create a page or a block or any other display type, master disappears. So it's there, it's hiding, and there's a setting in the views setting page that you can turn on to always show it if you want to see it. But the concept behind a master is do all your work in master, and then your displays might be themes and variations of that, and you can go in and override individual fields or settings or anything else that goes with it. Attachment is one kind of view attached to another kind of view. So you might have, in the case of the real estate agent, you might have a property listing and the open houses that are attached to that property listing. And you can actually make it use the same filters so that it's picking up the same data. So you'll see 10 properties here, you'll see the 10 or you'll only see the open houses that go with those 10 properties. You won't see all open houses. You can have, there's a new display type called embed, which does absolutely nothing. I think the intent,
What was it supposed to do? I was leading into your next sentence.
Yeah, it looks like the intent, and literally if you look at the code, it's got an @ to do. I think the intent was there is a code segment where you can do a views embed view and pull into PHP the results of a view. I think the intent was to literally make that the only kind of display that you could do that with, because right now you pass the second parameter, it says which display do you pull in. I think their intent was to only allow embed display types come into that through that way. That would improve the security, certainly, among other things. I still say, even though it doesn't do anything, if you're going to use your view in a piece of code, go ahead and set the embed display. That's sort of a signal to other developers as they come into this view that, oh, that's being used in code somewhere. I'm going to have to look in a different place to find it. The next one is really interesting. It's an entity reference display type. And so if you've ever used entity reference or node reference in Drupal 7, and it's an autocomplete field. So you start to type the title of the entity, and you can select what you want. You can actually, with this, you can create a view, and instead of using the autocomplete widget, you can use the view, entity reference view widget, and the results of your view will become a pull-down select list for the entity. So you can filter, you can sort, you can do relationships, you could build complex displays, you could make very, very powerful reference builders out of that. So it's, you know, I've done a couple of projects where we've had to have custom code to modify that autocomplete field to make it more user-friendly. This is going to eliminate all that custom code. And then finally, you've got RSS feeds and REST exports, which basically an RSS feed is a REST export with a slightly limited set of options. After that, you've got format options. You've got the grid. And in Drupal 8, there is one change from Drupal 7. Instead of using tables to do grids, they actually use divs. So it's really a grid, now a grid. You've got the HTML list, both ordered and unordered. You've got an unformatted list, which is without the ULs. You've got tables, which are very powerful. And then contributed modules will add additional format options. An accordion, a slideshow, or even a map. So those are all things that contributed modules make available to that. And then the options have, of course, formats have settings. Table being the most complex, basically, once you've created this table, you can make it title click sortable, you can combine fields together, you can slice and dice, basically, in a bunch of different ways. Because I'm a big fan of fields, the next thing you would do is you would do your fields, and you would list out the fields that you're going to use. So in this case, we're going to use a title, the asking price, the number of bedrooms, the square footage, and the neighborhood. A relatively simple listing. And every one of those fields has settings. So I can either enable the label or disable the label, the name of the field. I can change what's displayed if the label is there in a fixed way. I can exclude from display, which sounds counterintuitive. Why would you put something into a view and then hide it? You're going to use it later when you're doing field rewrites. And then in this particular case, we've got date. So date has a bunch of different ways it can be formatted. So all the various formatting options that are available. Style settings gives you access to HTML and CSS tools. And rewrite the results are one of my favorite. You get this text box, and you can rewrite the content of the field. And you're given a bunch of replacement patterns. And the way the replacement patterns work in Drupal 7 was they were square brackets, which is the token format of replacement tokens. Now they've gone to double curly braces because we're using Twig. So why not have a syntax that's very similar? And it gives you access to every field that's above the current field. That's why you exclude from display, is that you can add 3 or 4 fields, and then in the last one, rewrite it and output a combination of those put together. And so you could take a URL from one field and the text from a different field and put them together as a link and have that be displayed by putting the appropriate HTML in. And I got thinking after a while, you know, it's interesting. Those look a whole lot like Twig variables. I wonder if Twig's in there. And sure enough, that box is actually a user UI element that is a Twig template. And so you have access to anything you can do in Twig at the theme layer, you can do in a field rewrite layer, including the built-in control structures. So I just did a quick and dirty for letter in A to M as uppercase, print star and letter, and sure enough, I got all the letters to come out. So you have this very, very powerful capability that goes way beyond simple rewrites. So Amanda, why don't you tell us about filters?
Great. Well, filters let you select what part of the data you want the view to return. So one of the shows that we both like watching is Tiny House Nation, and they feature houses that are under 500 square feet. So I thought it might be fun to make a page that showed only tiny houses. So for that, I set a filter to limit the results to listings where the property square footage was less than 500 square feet. I could do that on an extra display of the main property listing view, so it was really pretty easy. And then expose filters let visitors choose what values they want to see. So in the real estate website, this view lets visitors set ranges for square footage, asking price, and number of bedrooms, so that they can find just the right amount of house for them at the right price. So Dad, I can see that for the neighborhood, I can filter by the neighborhood taxonomy. If I wanted to display each of those neighborhoods, would I just have to create a display for would I just have to set the filters to each neighborhood and then create the display for each one? Or is there an easier way to do that?
There is. But before we move on, one quick thing. This is where your no results setting becomes a big deal, because users can say, I want 3,000 square feet, an asking price of $10,000 with 22 bedrooms. And in most real estate markets, I doubt you would ever get a result from that. So the answer to Amanda's questions, is there a different way to do it, is actually over in that advanced column. And that's why I recommend that you always show that advanced column. And is a contextual filter. And contextual filters sound very hard, and they're over in the advanced column, so they must be very hard. And the easiest way to think about them is they're a filter that gets the value you're looking for from the URL. It could have just as easily been an extra checkbox in the filter part of the view, and it would have been just as functional as it is now. So in this particular case, what we might do is say available property listing by neighborhood, and we'll pass it city center, which is the name of one of the taxonomy terms that we happen to be using. And if you notice, there's this 20% 20 in there. And the reason for that is because when I set up the taxonomy term, I wasn't really thinking about using it as an exposed filter or a contextual filter. And URL rules don't let you have spaces in URLs. And so the way you have to do it then is the %20 to represent a space. So it makes for a little uglier URLs.
You can use a plus sign.
Or plus sign. But you're still going to end up putting something in there. And so what you would do is you would go over to contextual filters, click add, and it's very much like setting up a regular filter. The only difference is, or one of the really powerful things you can do, is if there is no value in the URL. So you can actually use contextual filters on blocks. When you think about it, blocks don't have URLs. There's no way to pass data to it. But you have a number of ways of getting to default data as long as it's known at the time that the page is being rendered. And so it's very common, you'll pick the provide default value. You can get things like the node ID, elements from the node. You can get the user ID and a number of other things that you can use to match against whatever you're filtering with. So that's another way of doing that. So Amanda, tell me about sorting.
Well, Sorry. Well, views wouldn't be too useful if all that was displayed, everything was done by date, the date it was entered. So since this is Drupal, anything is possible. So in views, you can change the ordering or the sort criteria at the bottom there. And you can also have multiple levels of sorting. So here we sort first by the property neighborhood that it's in, and then within each neighborhood we search it by title, just by ascending in this case.
Okay.
And then you look at the setting tabs for the sort criteria field. You can expose the sorting criteria so that visitors to the site can sort it however they'd like. And in this example, because we're using the date field, it adds the granularity option so that you can sort down to the second, or by the minute, day, hour. And then you use the second sort level. You can sort by another field, like we did alphabetically. So sorting is pretty easy, but using the structured content, like you described, I want to have a view that shows fields from the realtor along in each property listing. But when I try to do that, I can't see the field in my selection. So what do I have to do that?
I've run into that before, and it's a mistake I make a lot of times. What you need to do is define a relationship. So views by default doesn't follow reference fields. And so the easiest thing to do is you go in and you set in the view, you add a relationship. And what you do is in the relationship you can pick what field to relate by, and then that will tell you what entity you're going to pull in. And views will actually do either direction, but there's some serious performance problems if you go the wrong way. So if you remember, all the boxes had arrows on them, and you go from something to something. If you follow it that way, it's pretty performant because you can do that in the SQL query. If you don't follow it that way, you literally have to pull it in, sort it out, and do it in memory. And so it'll take views a little longer. So you'll almost always, when you add like an open house field to a view, you'll see two options. One will say content referenced from a particular field, and one content using. And so if you're in the open house and you can use the content using, if you were in the property, you would have to use the content referenced from. And once you select one of those, then you pretty much define the relationship. And when you go into the field, when you add the field, it still won't display. So now all of a sudden you have more options when you add fields, but the fields won't display. So you'll add the field and you'll look at your view and go, I know I added a field and there's nothing there. Why isn't that there? You also have to go back on every field that you add that's from the relationship and add the relationship. And views does that because it can have as many relationships as you want, and it needs to know which relationship to actually use. Because you could have an entity that's pointing to an entity that's pointing to an entity, and you could have a different field that points to the third entity directly. And so it needs to know which way to go. So when you look at it, what you'll see is in this particular version of the listing, property listing, we've got title and title. And that's a little confusing because why would we want to display the same title twice? Well, we're not really. In the first case, the title is the address that we happen to be using the title for addresses. And at the bottom, the title happens to be the realtor's name. And so what's happening down there is the realtor's name. And it's a hidden field because we're rewriting it with the phone because we wanted to have realtor name, comma, phone to make it more compact. Does that make sense? So, any questions? I'll take those. Job offers we'll let Amanda take care of.
When you're doing attachments, and I found it with 7, if I do batch, I'll get the initial list of the batch size, but I won't get anything after that with relationship values.
Good question. I've never tried it. I mean, I've done basic attachments, but not I'm past filters through, but never doing batches like that.
Well, we do it for Mercy College, and they'll send 10,000 web forms that we have to pull all the stuff out of. And it bogs down and stops, and I'll get the first 10. And the batch will show the time it was done and the other values, but anything that was relational is missing.
Beyond the first 10 or just
Yeah,
the first?
beyond the first 10. So
Okay.
you get all the times.
Are you timing out?
I believe that's what's happening. I thought batch was supposed to stop that. That it was supposed to keep you from timing out by...
I think PHP at some point times out.
Okay.
That's just a guess. I don't have any direct experience doing it.
We don't have access to the INI, so...
So what are you doing with the data? I mean, what do you want to do with it? You're just listing it?
Yep, that's really all they want to do. They want to be able to see it.
Pull it in their content?
Well, we end up running a drush and just doing it manually, but they still want to see the data from the web forms.
I'd either pull it into a table, define the table to views, or I would pull it into a content type that had those fields.
But when you do the export, the table doesn't matter. Like, they also want to see it in CSV.
Oh, you know what? If you don't find a solution, you should talk to Lee Walker.
Okay.
He does stuff at that level, and I don't know if you saw the lightning talk where he talked about the what he did with the Department of Energy.
Right.
But he deals with massive amounts of data and people wanting to see them certain way, especially and he did the Chattanooga State College, so you might know exactly what.
There are use cases where the queries generated by views are just too unperformant to be useful.
Yeah.
Because it isn't built to optimize the SQL it's generating. It's built to optimize the production of that SQL by non-technical people
All right.
or semi-technical people.
So he used Solar, and he had like 18 million views of rows of data, and he used a Sarnia module, S-A-R-N-I-A.
Yeah, and
Sarnia, okay.
The Sarnia worked?
That's what he said.
Because we don't have access to the PHP INI file, or we would just increase the memory and be done with it.
Well, he said he used that Sarnia module to connect the content and turn it into entities in a table.
Okay. Let me try
And then
that.
you could use Grab or something to do CSV downloads. He did it on bioenergy site in China.
Yeah.
The other option I've seen on some sites is literally use Solar just like a views replacement. So you define the Solar index very, very carefully to basically constrain the filters going in and the filters coming out to look a whole lot like what views would do. And the result of the index is that result.
And is it data from the web form module? These are web forms?
Yeah, these are web forms,
Why aren't you
and
just looking on the web form result page?
because they actually can't see enough of the data by doing that, it will time out on them.
Yeah, it almost feels like you need a custom query. You need a custom module. That's what I would do.
Other questions?
Oh, one thing I was going to ask, you were showing the two fields there where you had two content titles.
Yeah.
In Drupal 7, you can see that when you're selecting that second content title, you say, I want to use this relationship title, and then you can see that in your list.
Yeah, you see that it came from Realtor. You just don't see the fact that it comes
Right,
up as title. You can change the administrative title,
Okay, so
which
you've
is the
done
thing that
okay.
would let you
Okay,
basically
that's what I
do
was
something more
wondering.
meaningful.
Yeah.
But then it isn't as good an example for showing that you have two different fields in there. Other questions?
One stumbling block that I had when first working with views was the making sure that at the very top of the editor modal that you pay attention before clicking submit to what you're setting the change to. Is it all displays or just this one? That's
Yeah, override or or all displays and override for this display is a very, very common mistake.
And it's hard to remember to look up and check before, because you're working your way down that form and you just want to click save because you're done
See,
with it.
the intent was that you do that first and then you work your way through it. And the reality is, yeah, and then you go,
It's not a question, but I'll make a suggestion. You talked about exposing, making sure you set your settings so you always see master. If you end up with a lot of views, you know you're going to have a lot of views. Say you're doing a list of your blog posts and you want to have a page and you want a couple of different blocks. If you're kind of thinking about am I overriding, am I applying this to other blocks, etc. If you have that master display exposed, that reminds you that if I want to make a change and I want it to apply to all of my displays, do it in master, and that'll keep your view nice and neat. Being a front-end developer, I'm OCD about nice and neat. So
you almost
and
wish
that can keep you from
you could have one more setting in views, and it would say basically, if I'm on a display, I'm overriding. If I'm on master, I'm all displays. And then you would get something that would protect you from yourself.
Yeah.
But
and that keeps you from maybe having to redo your work because I made it on page and I wanted to reflect in block. How do I do that so you don't end up with 5 overridden displays that are really the same thing if you kept them nice and neat and used your master right.
Mm-hmm.
That saved
Good
me
point.
a whole bunch of time.
Good point. Well, thank you for coming, and I think it's lunch.
Yay.